Hello, beautiful mindsetters. It's that time of the week again where we bring you some more Mindset Learn. My name is Dawes Bonani, and today we have some interesting Learn Extra Life Sciences lined up. And I hope that you guys are ready and excited, and I hope that all of you have downloaded all the schedules as well as the notes that you need for today's show. Obviously, today I'm not alone. I'm with our wonderful resident teacher, Mr. Llewellyn. Hello, Llewellyn.
It's you again.
I'm sorry, you get. Why am I thinking of Llewellyn? How are you?
Good in yourself.
I'm good, good. Are you ready and excited for today's show?
No, excited as usual. I know we're back at school now. It's the first week of the second term.
And I actually hope that mindsetters at home are ready, because probably some of them are still into the holiday vibe thing going. And I think it's quite important for you guys to realize that it's back to school, back to books, more learning.
Absolutely, quite correct. I think, it's very important for the learners to start from day one. And we've had a week of school, and I think the guys need to get down from day one, because this is a major exam term. July exams, and obviously the guys need to be prepared for the exam. So let's start from week one.
True. What do you have in store for us today?
So today we're looking at animal tissues. It's just tying in what we finished off with in last term. Last term we looked at plant tissue. We did a bit of animal tissue, but today we're going to spend some time looking at animal tissue. We're going to discuss the major types of tissue, and then we've got to do a dissection, and we're going to be looking at some tissue in an actual living organism, and that's going to be quite fun. So I hope you guys are tuned in, and you're going to be joining us and staying with us for the rest of the lesson.
That's really interesting. So guys at home, make sure that you have all the study notes. You're probably wondering where to get all of them. Go to www.learnextra.co.za/live. If you have any sort of questions, please don't hesitate. Go onto our Facebook page and ask your question. That's www.facebook.com/learnextra. If you want, you could also visit us on Twitter, and we'll make sure that we interact with you right there. Our Twitter handle is @learnextra. Lastly, if you want to talk to us on email as well, please do. Don't hesitate. Our email address is helpdesk@learnextra.co.za, and we will make sure that we answer all your questions. Llewellyn, take it away.
Thanks. Okay, so we're looking at getting lots of questions from you guys. I'm looking at you, looking forward to interacting with you, and I know that you guys would have come back from a break into a new term, all ready and full of life. Let's get busy. Let's get busy from day one, guys. So just to sort of touch base with where we were last term. So last term we looked at organization of life. We looked at organic chemistry. We then went on to looking at cell division, and then we looked at tissues. We spent some time looking at plant cells. We looked at animal cells, and then we moved on to tissue. We spent the last lesson looking at plant tissues, and we looked at how cells became specialized to perform specific functions. Today we're looking at animal tissues, and just to touch base with tissues. So when we look at organization of life, I'm going to refer to a slide in a little while. It's basically showing how organisms from a simple cell become complex to form specialized cells together that have a specific function, and that's what a tissue is. A tissue is basically a group of cells that have a collective function and perform a specific function. So we're going to look at tissues today. But we're going to spend lots of time looking at animal tissues, and as I said, we're going to get through to a dissection in a little while, so I hope you guys are looking forward to that. I'm very excited about it. So let's go and look at what we have in store. So during the lesson today, we're going to discuss important terminology, guys, and I always stress that we've got to have a terminology list. You've got to build up your terminology list, especially when you're preparing for a test. You easily refer to your terms, and that's when you actually remember content. So develop a list of terminology. Before you start a chapter, guys, make sure you write down all the important terms and you constantly refer to them. Okay, we're going to look at the organization of life, and then we're going to spend some time looking at the tissues and how these specialized cells perform their specific functions. So let's move on to the first slide. So we're going to look at blood. What is blood? Blood is a type of tissue. We're going to spend lots of time talking about blood and the different types of cells that make up blood. We are also going to discuss, this was a terminology that we looked at in plants tissue, so chlorenchyma, a type of a permanent tissue. We also looked at companion cells when we looked at vascular tissue, that was the transportation tissue in plants. We're going to look at connective tissue today, which is part of animal tissue. The cuticle was tissue that we looked at, cells that we looked at in the plant. We're going to look at dermal tissue as well. Epidermal tissue we looked at in plants. We're going to look at epithelium tissue in humans or in animals. We've looked at ground tissue in plants. In plants, we also spoke about lignin, and we said that lignin was cells that had a waterproofing compound in. They were lignified cells, and that is what caused plants to become solid and hard, and that formed wood. We also looked at mesophyll tissue, the tissue that was responsible for packaging and filling up the spaces in tissue. Muscles we're going to discuss today. We're going to spend some time looking at different types of muscle tissue. We're also going to look at different types of nerves. We've discussed palisade parenchyma, and we said that palisade cells were the cells that were responsible for photosynthesis, and these, you see lots of these in the leaf. We also looked at phloem, and phloem, if you guys remember, was the tissue that is responsible for transportation of the food from the leaves, the products of photosynthesis, to the rest of the plant. We also looked at sclerenchyma, and this was strengthening tissue. The sieve tubes, again, part of your vascular tissue. They worked in conjunction with the companion cells. We also look at spongy mesophyll. We see this very clearly in a leaf. And then we obviously will look at stem cells when we look at animal cells today. And vascular tissue would refer both to plants and animals. And xylem, again, the conducting tissue in plants that is responsible for transportation of water. Let's look at organization of life. So the key thing is that you've got to be able to see the link from one chapter to the next. And we started off with looking at organic compounds at the beginning of the year. Your teachers have progressively gone through looking at how organic compounds form cells, and we spoke about two types of cells, animal cells and plant cells. We then went on to looking at how our cells divide, and we call that mitosis. Now we're looking at how cells become specialized to function together and form tissue. So when cells become specialized and they form a collective function, we refer to that as tissue. When we put tissues together that function collectively, these tissues give us organs. When we look at organs put together, these organs form a system, and then we have systems together forming an organism. So very quickly, we're going to look at this breakdown. And here we see, we're going to start from the simplest. It might not be very clear, but all forms of life are made up of atoms. So atoms are the smallest living thing, the smallest particles in anything. They form molecules, and we know that H2O, water, is an example of a molecule, and it's actually made up of atoms. We can look at our other molecules that are responsible for the formation of our lipids, our phospholipid bilayer in the cell membrane. Those are made up of molecules, and those molecules essentially are made up of atoms. So molecules put together, could give us organelles. When we look at organelles, guys, we spoke about the mitochondria, the chloroplast, the nucleus, the vacuoles. So these are specialized molecules put together that perform a specific function. So when we take all these organelles together, we put them together, we have a functioning unit, and that unit is referred to as a cell, and we refer to the cell as the simplest functional unit in a living organism. So you get unicellular organisms, that means it's a single cell that performs all these functions, or you get multicellular organisms, and hence we see, if we take these cells together and we put them, they become specialized, we form tissue. So we have tissues put together, and these tissues again can form organs. So if you look at an organ, would be collectively many tissues put together, and our organs give us organ systems. So if you talk about your respiratory system, your digestive system, it's made up of many organs. And then we finally take our organ systems, and they give us organisms, and we are examples of living organisms that have many systems. So you'd study the next chapter would be looking at the digestive system, looking at the excretory system, the reproductive system, the circulatory system. So these would be systems made up of specialized tissue, and that's why it's important to be able to understand and see the link from the simplest to the most complex.
Eugen, I think it's also quite important for mindsetters at home to remember that they get to learn about different types of organisms, different types of organs when they do grade 11 and 12. So it's quite important that they keep all of this in mind, because it will definitely come in very handy.
Yeah. What you're saying is very important, Knox, in that it's very important to have a good understanding of this now, because get to grade 12, we're probably going to be doing lots of DNA replication, protein synthesis. For us to be able to understand how an organism can produce proteins, we need to go back to the simplest. And hence you should be able to see the link between molecules becoming complex, forming organelles forming cells, cells forming your tissues forming organs collectively put together form a system. And that's what Knox said is vitally important, especially for you as a grade 10 learner going into grade 11 and 12. So let's move on to the details of animal tissue. So like when we studied plant tissue, we looked at meristematic tissue. In animal tissue, we have meristematic tissue as well, but we call that meristematic tissue basically embryonic tissue. Embryonic tissue refers to tissue that is produced, that is the tissue that gives rise to other cells. So tissue that constantly divides. And this can be divided into stem cells. Okay, we have, guys, if you remember, if you think about cell division, we spoke about division of cells, and we referred to meristematic tissue in plants. We probably mentioned embryonic tissue that constantly divides to produce new cells. And this is and this is what we're looking at. So the embryonic stem cells basically is tissue in the embryo that produces all the other tissues in growth. So life starts from a simple one-cell organism. When the sperm and the egg fuse together, they form a single cell, and that cell will constantly divide. And that process of division is called embryogenesis. And basically, it is the embryonic stem cells that constantly divide and become specialized. At the end of the gestational period, or the development of that embryo into a fetus, you have now tissues and cells become specialized to form tissues and eventually organs. And that is how organisms are young or born alive, that are capable of surviving independently, because the systems have been formed because of cells specializing and developing from the embryonic stem cells. We also see adult stem cells, and these are tissues in adult that produces new tissue cells that replace the old and damaged tissue. When we look at blood cells, guys, we know that the red blood cells are constantly replaced, but where do those cells come from? Yes, they come from the bone marrow. So if you think about, you probably heard in the newspapers and you read about people that are affected with leukemia and they need bone marrow transplants. The question is, why do they need these bone marrow transplants? It's for these stem cells. And so we try and replace the stem cells with stem cells that are not malignant, that are not cancerous, so that these individuals can have stem cells that produce new cells and that can replenish the amount of blood cells in their body. Okay, so animal tissue, the permanent tissue, consists of 4 major types. So we looked at the meristematic tissue, or the stem cell tissue. Here we're looking at now the permanent tissue. Now this is permanent tissue which has become specialized as an individual, as an organism ages and becomes mature. Right. So we're going to look at 4 major types of tissues today. We're going to look at the epithelial tissue. We're going to look at connective tissue. We're going to spend lots of time looking at muscle tissue and nerve tissue. Okay, so we're going to go for a break, and when we come back, we're going to be actually cutting up an organism to look at the different types of tissue. So we'll try and see the tissue. We might not be able to see all, but I'll try and point out the different types of tissues to you, and then we will get back and look at the details of each of these tissues. So Knox, over to you.
Mindset is, we just got a very, very interesting comment from Nomfundo. Nomfundo says that she misses watching Mindset Learn, right? Because she's at boarding school. Now, I think it's quite important for you guys at home to remember that you don't have to be left behind. Go to our website, get all those notes, also visit YouTube and get all the videos. That way, you will be, tagging along with us, even when you're in the bush or wherever you are. So make sure that you join us after the break, because we'll be continuing with some more Grade 10 Life Sciences. Mindsetters, welcome back to our show today. I hope that you guys are freshened up and ready to continue. We have something that is very, very interesting for you today. We have a very practical experiment for you guys to sort of internalize everything that we've learned today. You are ready?
Knox, I'm ready. Dinner's served.
Sure. Take it away.
So guys, we're going to look at, and I said when we get back, we're going to look at doing a dissection, but I didn't promise you that it was going to be a human. I didn't say it was going to be a cadaver. So, and most of the times, I know you guys probably might help your mom or dad at home sometimes at the bribe, but you often have to have a chicken that you need to either skin or you need to prepare. But this is a classical example of being able to see most of the tissue. So we looked at, before we went on to break, we looked at the 4 different types of permanent tissue. And these were, I don't know if you can see the board, but these were, we looked at our epithelial tissue, we looked at the muscle tissue, and we looked at connective tissue. Unfortunately, the 4th type, the nerve, we're not going to be able to see that because we would need a microscope to be able to do that. But what we're going to look at today is, just by looking at a chicken, we want to see what are the different types of tissues that we can identify. So during the break, guys, I was busy trying to remove the outer covering of this. And I know that you guys probably, for me, I know I don't enjoy I do have a chicken, but I don't enjoy the skin, and I remove the skin. And I just want to tell you why the skin is obviously removed. So the skin is the outermost epithelial cover, and that's the protective cover, and that's a type of tissue. But below the skin, guys, you'll find that, I don't know if you guys can see, but you know that there's lots of fat. And the fat also is a type of tissue, and that's adipose tissue. So basically, it serves as thermoregulation, it serves as insulation. It also has a protective function. We have fat below our skin. It's very important for us to have fat in our body to a certain amount. We have some good fat, and that's obviously for insulation. It protects the organs. Not having fat at all, that's also a disadvantage. It can be traumatic to you. You find that individuals that have no fat in their body often have a problem with hormonal levels being imbalanced. What we're going to look at today is I'm going to try and cut this chicken up and try and show you the difference. So the different tissues. So what we're looking at now is, guys, and obviously these are the breast of the chicken, and often you have fillets. And if we looked at the breast of the chicken, this is muscle. And this is, you're actually consuming the muscle or the meat. The meat is actually, we call this white meat, is because the meat is white compared to lamb and beef. But here you clearly see this is a type of muscle. And the breast is the most succulent part of the chicken, is because that is where most of the meat and most of the muscle is. And these are the muscles that actually are responsible for providing the strength for the bird, and in relation to other birds, for them to be able to fly. So I'm going to try and while I'm removing the skin, guys, I'm going to talk to you about in terms of the different types of tissues that we're going to look at. So we're going to try and cut up the wing as well. I'm going to very quickly try and get off the skin from the hind limbs of the chicken. I'm going to try and remove the skin here. Okay, so I'm going to try and tease through that. And you guys can try this out when you're trying to help mom and dad. Don't dissect the chicken, but make sure that you have the consent when you're trying to do this. But try and remove the skin first so that you can clearly see some of the tissue. So we're actually removing the epithelial tissue. I'm going to try and get as much of the tissue out as possible so that we can see some muscle. And we want to see, very importantly, how muscle is attached onto the bone. So here we can see we've got most of the tissue, the skin out on this side here. Okay, here's the Preen gland, guys. And when we look at some of the specialized cells, here, this is a Preen gland. And if you look at the Preen gland, guys, if you feel the Preen gland, it feels obviously very oily and very moist. And this is what the birds or the chicken uses to basically preen itself. So this is a gland that produces a fat or sebum, and so the chicken or the birds normally use their beaks, they rub their beaks on the preen gland, and then they preen their feathers. Obviously it's a little fatty, and hence it helps to waterproof the feathers, and hence make them waterproof. Okay, so here we have, these are the hind limbs, but very quickly we're going to look at muscle. So we're going to speak about muscle, and we're going to look at different types of muscle. What is the function of muscle? Muscle brings about movement. So in order for movement to take place, the muscles need to be attached to bone, and bones need to be attached to each other. So we're going to look at, when we look at muscle, we're obviously looking at different types of muscles. So we have 3 different types of muscles, guys. We have smooth muscle, we have cardiac muscle, and we have skeletal muscle. Now the skeletal muscle basically are the muscles that are responsible for bringing about movement. So when we look at the chicken here, guys, the movement that is brought about by the chicken are by these muscles. So here we know that this is the tender part of I think lots of people prefer the. Okay, so I've cut through a joint. Okay, they prefer the thigh and the drumstick. Here I've got into the drumstick. I'm trying to cut through the joint here. Okay, so here we've got some cartilage. I'm going to go through there. What we're essentially trying to show you is basically, I'm going to show you muscles and how they're attached to each other. So here we have, obviously this is the drumstick, and here at the tip of the drumstick you're going to find I've cut through the cartilage. I'm going to very quickly try and remove. Okay, So when we're going to look at, this is cartilage that rubs onto another bone. So you can see it's white. It's hyaline cartilage.
You again.
Yes, Knox.
Is it healthy to eat cartilage?
I'm sure it's a difficult question. I wouldn't say it's unhealthy, but I know that it's the crispy part of the chicken. Some people prefer chewing it. I don't really have a fancy for it, but I don't see any disharm in having it. It's some people prefer having it. I don't really see any problems with it. I'm not too sure in terms of its nutritive value whether it has any. It's compared to the actual muscle and the actual meat of the chicken. So, but yeah, some people have a fetish for it. I don't, and not because it doesn't have any nutritional value, but just because I don't like it. But yeah. So here, guys, we're seeing here's cartilage, and if we look at that cartilage, guys, you'll see that the cartilage here is basically, it's a hyaline cartilage. It's the cartilage that's present between joints, and it is this cartilage that is, it's strong, it's resistant, it prevents the friction between joints, and you know that when bones are constantly moving, the cartilage can absorb the friction that is there, as well as during movement. In terms of this organism will not fly as much, so it walks a lot, and hence it's gonna be able to absorb shock from mechanical movement. I intentionally did not cut the wing off, guys, but if we look at the wing, here we're going to look at, I'm not too sure if you guys can see this, but I'm going to try and lift this up for you guys to be able to see. So very similar to our human arm, and like the arms of most other organisms that have a forearm. Here you're seeing, this is the upper arm. So here you see the femur, the humerus, the humerus, the ulna and the radius, and here you're going to get the phalanges. But when we look at the point of attachment here, guys, we're going to try and look for the tendon, and the tendon would be, guys, if we were to describe a tendon, we would be describing that part, that connective tissue that is responsible for attaching the bone onto, attaching bones to bones. So here or muscle to bone. Here we're trying to get in deep in here. Try and open this up for you a bit. Okay, there. Okay, I'm just going to try and remove some of that excess tissue around here. Okay, so here we're finding the head between, right here, very nice and clear. If you notice the color of this, guys, it's very white. Okay, so here we're finding that this bone is attached onto that bone at the joint by a tendon. So this white structure here that we're looking at is a tendon, and the function of a tendon is to attach the muscle onto the bone. We're going to look at ligaments in a little while, and ligaments would be attaching bone to bone. So remember that in order for movement to take place, your muscles need to be attached onto the bone. In order for joints to be able to bring about movement, the joints need to be attached to each other. So if you're confused about what a tendon is, think about your Achilles tendon, and that's the tendon right at your heel, and that obviously attaches the calf muscle to your heel bone, and that's obviously very sore when you injure it, but it's an extremely strong connective tissue that actually helps to hold the muscle to the heel bone. We also find that's the ligaments, and the ligaments are keeping the bones together in position. So I'm going to now I'm going to try and turn this chicken around. I'm going to try and show you so these are the muscles. Here we're going to have, okay, so I'm going to try and cut this up here to show you the skeletal muscle. And often when you cut this up, you see, okay, so that's quite nice. Here you see that this type of muscle, guys, we refer to this as skeletal muscle. And here you clearly see, I know this when you boil chicken, Knox, you'll be able to, when you're having it, you can easily you can peel off, or you can rub off the fibers, and that's basically muscle fibers that easily peel off. So this would be an example of the skeletal muscle, and it's important for bringing about movement. Okay, what else? So we looked at, we unfortunately will not be able to see blood, because blood obviously would have been coagulated in this, but we're going to try and cut further deep into this chicken to be able to see if we can see some of the internal organs, and those have been removed. But here we see lots of fat, and again adipose tissue, Okay, the heart has been removed, but if we were to look at the heart, I'll be able to point out the heart right here. Okay, I'm going to open up the heart for you guys. So we've got the liver in here, we've got the gizzard. Okay, so I'm going to remove that for you. Okay, so I'm going to get the heart out somewhere in here. There's it, right down there. Okay, so when we look at the heart, and what is unique about the heart, guys, like in every other organism, the heart never stops beating. So if we were to look at the type of muscle, that the heart is actually a muscular organ. It's made up of cardiac muscle. We're going to look at some slides in a little while, but what is different about cardiac muscle as compared to smooth muscle and the muscle that is involved in your skeletal muscles is that the cardiac muscle is made up of, and you'll see diagrams of this intercalated disc. It's an extremely strong muscle. It never tires out. It's constantly contracting and producing energy, and it has lots of mitochondria that produces energy to bring about movement. It's probably one of the strongest muscles in the body. The smooth muscles, these muscles will be lining the blood vessels. So the blood vessels, the arteries, the veins, lining along the esophagus, that contract and bring about movement of food along the esophagus, that bring about movement of blood along the vessels. That would be your smooth muscles. So your smooth muscles line the blood vessels, the arteries, the organs, the trachea, the esophagus, and that brings about movement of contents along a tube. So we've looked at muscles. We've discussed basically the three types of muscles. We've looked at connective tissue. We spoke about the hyaline connective tissue, the cartilage that's present in the bone. We also spoke about tendons. We spoke about ligaments. We looked at their functions. I'm going to try and see if we can look at the vertebral column. Okay, and obviously we have, in the vertebral column, guys, we also have connective tissue here. And the vertebral column, because the organism is not an organism that stands upright, you'll find that the cartilage that is present between the invertebrate disc are not as developed as compared to organisms like us or like other organisms that have a strong backbone. Here you can clearly see the white areas here clearly indicate, guys, the presence of cartilage. And the presence of cartilage basically is between the vertebrae so that it reduces friction between the bones that move, as well as it's there to absorb shock. What I want to do now is I want to actually cut up the head of the bone, and the reason why I want to do that is for you to be able to see the third type, or one of the different types of connective tissue, which is bone tissue. Bone is actually a connective tissue with a solid matrix. It contains osteocytes, so the bone cells that actually makes it very hard. So I'm sure you guys have chewed through a bone. Some of us chewed through bones, and when we're having the chicken, and I know Knox asked me about cartilage. I personally don't prefer the bones, but I'm going to show you, I'm going to try and remove the tissue around the bone so that we can cut up a bone and look at how the bone looks like internally. And one thing you've got to remember is that because birds are animals that are organisms that are built for flight, their bones are relatively soft, and this probably will be very prevalent if you eat non-veg, if you normally eat meat and chicken. If you notice the difference between a bone in a lamb or in beef, you'll find that the bones are much heavier in mammals, in mammals such as that walk on all fours, as compared to an organism that flies. So the bird bones are definitely much more hollow. They're weaker, and they are lighter. And the reason why it is so that the body weight is much lesser, and there's less energy spent on flight. Okay, so here we've removed most of the flesh off the bone. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly remove that there for you. Okay, so remember that when you look at bones and support here, we're clearly seeing, okay, so that's quite the end of the bone. Dancing around. Knox says he's not having chicken for supper tonight. Producer also says she's not having chicken for supper tonight. But I definitely am not going to cook this chicken. So when we look at this bone, guys, here you can clearly see the ends of the bone, and they call the heads or the epiphysis, and the shaft is called the physis. I'm going to try and break this bone, and it's possible, but it's okay. And what you'd notice is that you can see it's lots of red tissue in there, and that's bone marrow. That's the embryonic, that's the adult stem cells. And these are the cells that constantly produce the new cells. Okay, it's hollow. Obviously, it's an adaptation of this organism for flight. It makes it, but if we break into this, the bones, I said, are not as osteophyte or hardened as in an animal like a sheep or a lamb, but it's quite brittle. They bend very easily. And here we're seeing, okay, so now we're cutting up the bone, and here you can clearly see the bone marrow. So what we're looking at here is the bone marrow, and look at the distinct dark red color, and that is obviously stem cells that give rise to blood, and that give rise to the blood cells. So here we're clearly seeing it's a hollow bone, not as dense as bones of an ox or a lamb. They're much more hollow, and again I spoke about its adaptation. So we clearly see here the bone marrow, and this is what actually makes the blood cells. We also spoke about it being lightweight, very thin bone structure. Let's see. I'm not sure if there's questions, Knox, from your side.
Not yet, but I have a question, right?
Okay, cool.
What is the debate around stem cells? Because like it's a very, very big issue in the health industry. What's the debate? And can learners expect to find, a question that asks them to talk about the debate around stem cells?
It's quite an interesting. It's a very prevalent topic. There's lots of research going on stem cell research, and basically, I'll give you a personal story in terms of when we were having our second baby, we had the option of storing the stem cells in the umbilical cord. And at the moment, research is going towards that direction. We anticipate that in the future, we would come to a point where we would be able to grow tissues. We would be able to grow tissues from stem cells. And that would basically compensate them. That'll be a sort of a research. Research is going on in this to combat a shortage of organs. It'll also mean that if you can generate stem cells from your own, if you can generate tissue from your own stem cells, you're actually reducing the chances of organ rejection, reducing the waiting periods for people to donate organs. So the ethical issue about it is how stem cells would be used and how that research would be used. It needs to be regulated properly. There needs to be clear policies in place in terms of research that is conducted on stem cells. But in terms of the progress of science, I can definitely tell you that there's lots of opportunities for stem cells in the future, and lots of research is being done at the moment.
But then with that being said, I think mindsetters at home should be very, very aware of the different views around the use of stem cells from religious people, from an ethical level, from the medical background, just to expand your horizon and to sort of help you guys and guide you as you answer the question around the stem cell debate.
Absolutely. You'll find that we often, and teachers often tend to put in what we call the LO3, the Learning Outcome 3, and that is basically testing you on your understanding about life sciences, society, and the environment. So you as a life sciences learner should have some indication. You should have your opinion about things. I mean, be it stem cell research, be it cloning, be it your opinions about abortion, be it your opinions about contraceptives. You should, as a life science learner, have an opinion and be able to support your position, and that's very important. Having an opinion is good, but being able to say why you strongly feel that stem cell research is the way going forward. And I think it is, looking at all our exam papers, going up to grade 10, 11, and 12, we find that we always put in a question, an opinion-based question, and we throw that to the learners where they need to motivate in terms of why they would agree with some topic, for example, in this case, stem cells, or why they would disagree. And often they bring in the points of ethical, against nature, unnatural, and these cannot be marked wrong. It's basically based on your true values and how you substantiate them in the classroom. So I think, Knox, we're going to go in for a break. We're not going to cook this chicken tonight for supper because I've not done a very good job. My wife's not going to be happy that I've cut chicken today, but I'm sure chicken's not on the menu for us tonight. So over to you, Knox.
Thank you very much, Hugo, and I hope that you guys have learned a lot. It's just a lot to take in, so make sure that you guys go onto the internet and learn more about the stem cell research and the debate that is going on around it. But for now, let's just take an ad break. Make sure that you join us after this. Welcome back from the ad break. I hope that you guys are ready and refreshed to continue with our life sciences today. Quickly though, if you look on our Facebook page, you'll realize that there's a table that John and I have put out for you guys. So please guys, make sure that when you study all the time, you sort of use that sort of template, and you first look at the thing that you're studying, and then look at its functions, and then its as well as its location. So you might want to do that for all the tissues that are there, and this will help you, to have a very, very quick and interesting summary as you revise for your exams.
Absolutely, Knox. It's very important when you're studying cells, you know their structure, function, and location. So when you look at anything, especially when it comes to tissues, learn the tissue, the structure, its function, and its location. And the best way to do it is to do it to tables, where you clearly see the link between different types of tissues, their structures, their locations, and their functions. So let's get on to let's look at what so we looked at the tissues. I'm going to very quickly go back into the theory of it. We spoke about epithelial tissue, and we said that epithelial tissue was basically, let's go there, sorry. So the epithelial tissue was basically tissue that was for covering and lining. So example would be the skin, and below the skin we saw that there was adipose tissue. We also spoke about connective tissue, and this was tissue for structure, strength, binding, and transport. So the connective tissue would be the muscle, would be the bones, the tendons, the ligaments, as well as the blood, which we're going to look at in a little while. We spoke about the muscle tissues. We're going to look at the three different types: smooth, striated, and your cardiac muscles. And we're going to spend some time looking at the nervous tissue, or neurons, and that's basically for bringing about communication and coordination in the body. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly go on to some diagrams, and here we're going to see these are types of epithelial tissue, and you get epithelial tissue that's simple epithelial tissue, and then you get epithelial tissue that is specialized, and that means that they perform specific functions. So the most basic is squamous epithelial, and squamous epithelial, guys, is simple cells that are flattened, and that's what we find on our skin. The skin layer in the chicken was squamous epithelium. We also find that the skin layer, the outermost, is a squamous. The leaf has squamous epithelium. We saw squamous epithelium. When it becomes stratified, stratified basically means that the tissue is layered. And here you can clearly see that that's the basal membrane, or the basement membrane. And from that, you find that there's new tissue that is produced, or new cells that are produced. And as the new ones move towards and become older, they become flattened, and they become thin and flattened, and hence that's a characteristic of that, and we refer to that as squamous epithelium, and in this case a stratified cell. Sometimes your simple epithelium can become columnar or column-shaped cells, so these cells are longer than they are broader. So that's a column-shaped cell, and we call that columnar epithelium. And sometimes these may be specialized to perform specific functions of secretions, so they might be known as goblet cells, or they might have some cilia on them, which are hair-like outgrowths, and we find this along the trachea that help to filter the air to remove dust particles. We also see that sometimes cells could become cuboidal. So these cells are cube-shaped cells, and here you can see they have these sort of a cube-shaped cells, and these are found lining blood vessels as well. Sometimes cells could be pseudo-stratified. So the word pseudo meaning false, so they might show some sort of stratification, but it's actually not true stratification like we see it in the squamous epithelium. Okay, so we're going to move on to looking at some of the other tissues very, very quickly. We also spoke about muscle tissue, and we need to look at muscle tissue. We spoke about three types. We spoke about cardiac muscle tissue, and cardiac comes from the word the heart, which is found in the heart. We said the smooth muscle tissue, and these are, so the fibers, the cells appear very smooth, spindle shape, and that's how they appear. Not much striations as compared to your striated muscle or your skeletal muscles. So when we look at the skeletal muscles, you clearly see sort of striations in between the muscle fibers, and this is what gives it that striated appearance. It's also known as striated or involuntary or voluntary muscles. So this brings about movement in the body, and this you would find attaching to the bones to bring about movement. Your smooth muscles, we said, lining the organs, lining blood vessels, capillaries, arteries, veins. And your cardiac muscles, the characteristic of cardiac muscles is that if you look at here, you see branching and you see intercalated intercalated disc, and that would be a characteristic. The very, very distinct difference between these two is that they show clear striations with intercalated discs. We also looked at lots of connective tissue, and here we're seeing a diagram that shows you the knee joint of a human, and at that several different types of connective tissue. So the first connective tissue that we need to look at is blood. And blood is actually a type of connective tissue that is made up of different cells. So you've got your red blood cells, guys, or your erythrocytes. You've got your white blood cells, or your leukocytes. And you also have your platelets, which are the thrombocytes. We're going to look at the functions very briefly. The white blood cells are basically the cells that are responsible for the immunity in the body. Your blood cells, your red blood cells, are responsible for transportation of oxygen because they have hemoglobin in them. And your platelets are responsible for clotting of blood, and that's for the repair of tissue and blood vessels when they rupture. We also see here's loose connective tissue, and this tissue is basically loose because you find that it's made up of, it's not a dense tissue, it's made up of loose fibers, and in there are lots of spaces, air spaces, and the significant feature about loose connective tissue is that it's sort of packaging, very similar to the mesophyll cells, but here it's found cushioning the joints around organs so that it helps to sort of cushion the organ and have a protective function. Cartilage we looked at, and the white cartilage we saw was hyaline cartilage, and that is there. You'll find it's between joints, and here you clearly see that the white hyaline cartilage that is present at the ends of the heads of the bones, and that is there so that it reduces friction, it absorbs shock due to mechanical movement, and that we see. We also look at another type of connective tissue, which is bone. Bone is also a type of connective tissue. Here's a cross section showing you the Haversian system, and you can clearly see so the canaliculi. I'm sure you guys would have looked at it in a textbook. It's a bit more clear, but this is where the blood cells, the bone marrow is present, and where stem cells actually form. Okay, and obviously adipose tissue, we saw lots of fat under the skin, and here you can see it's colored in yellow. This is the adipose tissue, and again those are fat droplets, accumulation between, this is called subcutaneous tissue below the outer skin, and that's obviously protective to the organism. It's important that fat is around. Excessive fat is not good, however. And then obviously we looked at fibrous connective tissue, and the fibrous connective tissue is what connects, forms your ligaments and your tendons. Okay, so we're going to move on to very quickly looking at what nerves are made up of. And so a nerve cell is basically a cell that is specialized to conduct impulses. Nerve cells are called neurons, and these neurons have a conducting function. So it's simply a cell which is extended with a cytoplasm on either ends. So we have that forming the wiring system of our body, and that's very important to bring about coordinated movement and coordination in the body. So we have three different types of neurons. We have your sensory neurons, we have your motor neurons, and we have your connecting neurons. So these could also be called by the way they function, and they can be classified by the way they function or by their structure. So I'm going to refer to a diagram very quickly that shows you the structure, a very schematic diagram. And here we find that this neuron is called a unipolar neuron. Unipolar because we have a central cell body, and from that a single outgrowth. So here we see a single outgrowth from the cell body. Here we're seeing a bipolar neuron, and the bipolar means that they are bi, meaning two outgrowths from the central cell body. One outgrowth which carries the impulse towards the cell body, and the other that takes it away. So the one that carries it towards the cell body is called the dendrite, and the axon will carry the impulse away from that cell body to the next neuron. We also have the third type, the multipolar neuron, the word multi meaning several outgrowths. So from the cell body here, it's a bit faint, guys, but there are several outgrowths called dendrites from the cell body that receive impulses from other neurons. So in terms of when we talk of the network of neurons, you'll find that these connect sensory neurons to motor neurons, and we see them predominantly in the central nervous system, that means in the brain as well as in the spinal cord. And the structure that conducts impulses away from a cell body is an axon. Okay. To look at the typical structure of a neuron, we say that a neuron is made up of a cell body, and from that cell body we have outgrowths called dendrites. It's a bit faint in the diagram, guys, but these outgrowths are called dendrites that receive impulses, and they conduct those impulses towards the cell body. The cell body would process that, and then it will conduct an impulse to the next, it will pass it on to the next neuron. And the part of the neuron that conducts the impulse away is called the axon. At the end of the axon, we find we've got the terminals, or the dendrites, that form connections with other neurons or a muscle to bring about a response. Okay, so we're going to very quickly, as usual, it's very important, guys, for you to be able to revise. So I've put up some questions here, and I think it's a very important way of being able to revise, to be able to for us to see how we learnt. We look at questions, we try and answer questions, and you've got to get into that habit of looking at questions. The diagram below shows various tissues found in the knee region of a chimpanzee. Now, what is unique about this diagram is that it's very similar to the diagram that we saw earlier on, where I just had was color. Here we've got a diagram that's in black and white. It's called the knee region of a chimpanzee. Nothing different from a human knee region. So I'm sure you guys are going to now be able to identify this diagram, relate that to the diagram that we've had already, and then try and answer these questions. So the question is, so here we've got quite a few tissues. We've got tissue A, we've got tissue B, C, and D. So the first question is, well, it's identify tissues A, B, C, D, and E. Okay, we cannot see E very clearly here, but when we look at this tissue, here we're seeing this diagram that points to the structure here. Now, when we looked at the previous diagram of the human, we saw that this was the bone, so this would be the bone, or the bone connective tissue. Here we're looking at cells that point to the structure here. So this is a blood vessel, and inside the blood vessels, so these would be your blood cells. Okay, if we go down, slightly further down, this structure points here, it points to the cartilage. So this would be your hyaline cartilage. If we look at this, guys, points to the muscle, and here you can see muscles, and those are the striations of the muscles. Okay, we're going to very quick look at the last question. Which tissue provides food and oxygen for the knee joint? And guys, that's quite simple. Remember that the transportation of nutrients, oxygen, water takes place through blood. So that tissue would be blood that supplies the joints with nutrition and water. Okay. I'm going to end off with this question here, and then I'm going to leave that to you guys to answer. A vet carried out a knee jerk test on a chimpanzee to determine its reflex response. Name the neuron responsible for transmitting the impulse to the central nervous system. So the doctor tested the knee jerk. He pressed a point on the knee in response to establish whether there was movement. Which is the neuron? The neuron that will carry the impulse to the central nervous system is the sensory neuron. So we wanted to answer that question. The answer to that is sensory neuron. Guys, we've gone through this. We've looked at animal tissue. I'm going to chat to you in a little while. I'm going to hand you over to Knox.
Thank you very much, Mindsetters. I hope that you guys learned a lot and that you guys were very, very happy with the show that we brought you today. Make sure that you go onto our Facebook page and ask us all those questions that you have. Also email us, that's helpdesk@learnextra.co.za, or you can also tweet us at learnextra, and we'll make sure that we answer all your questions. It's been lovely being with you. I hope that you guys are very, very, excited, and you're also happy with the show that we had today. But lastly, importantly, I want you guys to remember that you have to use a lot of questions for you guys to practice. Go to old question papers so that they can help you. From myself, Eugen, and the rest of the Mindset crew, see you soon. Goodbye.